On the 30th of March, in the year 1939, a thin little comic book went on sale on the newsstands of America for the price of a single dime, 10 cents, and tucked inside it, across just 6 pages, was the very first appearance of a character who would still be published every single month more than 85 years later, and whose debut issue would one day sell at auction for well over $1 million. That comic was called Detective Comics, and the character was a caped figure who prowled the rooftops of a shadowed city, and tonight, softly and slowly, we are going to wander through the whole strange and sprawling history of him, of Batman, one quiet fact at a time. So settle in, get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, and if drifting through the long history of the Dark Knight is the kind of thing that helps you let the day go, feel free to leave a gentle like on the video, and maybe tell me down in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight, so this quiet little cave has a few more friendly faces in it. And now, with no hurry at all, let's begin at the very beginning, with the 2 young men who dreamed him up. The story of who created Batman is more complicated and more bittersweet than most people ever knew. For decades the credit went entirely to one man, a young artist named Bob Kane, whose name alone appeared on the comics, who signed every Batman story, who became wealthy and famous as the character's sole creator. But the truth was that Batman was really the work of 2 people, and the other one, a quiet young writer named Bill Finger, went almost entirely unrecognised for the whole of his life. It was Finger who did much of the work that made Batman into Batman, and yet for the better part of a century, hardly anyone knew his name at all. When Bob Kane first sketched the character, the design he came up with was quite different from the figure we know today. His early Batman had stiff, bird-like wings rather than a cape, a simple domino mask over the eyes instead of a full cowl, and a bright red costume. It was Bill Finger who looked at that first sketch and suggested the changes that transformed it. He suggested a cowl with pointed ears to hide the whole face and make it more frightening, a flowing cape cut to look like bat wings rather than rigid ones, the removal of the bright colours in favour of dark and shadowy greys, and gloves to hide the fingerprints. Nearly everything that makes Batman visually iconic, that unmistakable silhouette, came in large part from Finger's suggestions. And Finger did far more than shape the look. He wrote that very first story, the 6-page tale that introduced the character, and he gave Batman his human name, deciding that the man beneath the mask should be called Bruce Wayne. He drew that name from history, from Robert the Bruce, the Scottish hero, and from Mad Anthony Wayne, a general of the American Revolution, wanting a name that sounded both aristocratic and a little bit dangerous. Finger also created the city Batman would call home, and named the police commissioner who would become his greatest ally, and had a hand in dreaming up many of the villains too. He was, in every meaningful sense, a co-creator, and arguably the more important of the 2. But the credit belonged, by contract and by the custom of the time, to Bob Kane alone, and Bill Finger lived out his life in relative obscurity and financial struggle, never receiving the recognition or the riches his work had earned. He died in the mid-1970s, largely forgotten, his role in creating one of the most famous characters in the world, known only to a handful of comics insiders. It is one of the great injustices in the history of the medium, a man who helped build an empire and was left with almost nothing, not even his name on the thing he made. The story did have a kind of ending, though it came far too late for Finger himself. Decades after his death, thanks to years of tireless campaigning by fans and researchers and by Finger's own granddaughter, the world finally began to set the record straight. Starting in the middle of the 2010s, Batman comics and films and shows began carrying a new credit line, acknowledging that the character was created by Bob Kane, with Bill Finger at last giving the quiet writer his due, if only in memory. It is a small justice, arriving generations late, but it means that now, when you see The Dark Knight, you can remember both of the young men who dreamed him up, the one who took the credit and the one who did so much of the work. The character they created did not spring from nowhere, of course, but was stitched together from a whole tapestry of older inspirations, and tracing them is one of the quiet pleasures of his history. There was the masked Avenger Zorro, the wealthy man who pretended to be a harmless fop by day and fought injustice in a black cape and mask by night. A template Batman follows almost exactly. There was a pulp magazine hero called the Shadow, a dark and frightening vigilante who struck terror into criminals from the shadows, whose grim tone Batman borrowed heavily. There was even an old sketch by Leonardo da Vinci, a design for a flying machine with bat-like wings that Bill Finger reportedly showed as a reference for the cape. And there was a film, a spooky old mystery movie from 1930 called The Bat Whispers, about a criminal who dressed as a bat and projected a bat-shaped signal onto the walls to terrify his victims, an image that surely helped inspire both the costume and later the famous signal in the sky. Mix all of that together, the Gentleman Avenger and the shadowy pulp hero and the old Batwing designs and the frightening theatricality, and add the young imaginations of two men in their early 20s working for a few dollars a page, and you have the strange alchemy that produced the Dark Knight. He was, from the very start, a creature assembled from the dreams and fears of the pop culture that came before him. But to understand the man beneath the cowl, you have to go back before the costume and the cave and the long war, all the way back to a single night that broke a child's world in two. The man who would become Batman was born Bruce Wayne, the only child of Thomas and Martha Wayne, one of the oldest and wealthiest families in the whole of Gotham City. His father, in most tellings, was a gifted doctor and surgeon, a man who could have lived in idle comfort, but chose instead to give much of the family fortune away, quietly pouring it back into the struggling city he loved. His mother was remembered for her warmth and her grace and her charity, and for a little while the boy's life was as safe and golden and unremarkable as any child's has ever been, which is exactly what makes what came next so unbearable. One evening the three of them went out together to see a film at the Picture House, and in many of the most beloved versions of the story it is a film about the masked swordsman Zorro, that same Gentleman Avenger who helped inspire Batman in the first place, a small and haunting echo folded quietly into the tale. Afterward, rather than wait for the car, they walked, taking a shortcut down a narrow side street, and there in the dark a desperate man with a gun stepped out of the shadows and demanded what they had. In some tellings he wanted Martha's pearl necklace, in others simply their money, but the ending is always the same, for something went wrong in those few short seconds, as it so often does, and two shots rang out, and both parents fell dead on the wet pavement, while the boy stood frozen between them, untouched, spared for no reason at all. There is an image from that night that has become one of the most famous in all of comics, the string of Martha Wayne's pearls breaking as she falls and scattering across the ground, each small white bead bouncing and rolling away into the gutter, and it has been drawn 1,000 times, that little cascade of pearls, because it captures something wordless about the whole tragedy. Beauty and violence and loss all tangled together in a single quiet instant. The alley where it happened would come to be known as Crime Alley, a place that had once been the grandest part of the city, and had fallen over the years into shadow and decay, and Batman would return there every year, on the anniversary for the rest of his life, to stand quietly in the dark and remember. In many versions of the story, the boy is not entirely alone in that terrible hour, for a kind doctor named Leslie Tompkins, who ran a small clinic among the poor of that fallen neighbourhood, is said to have come to him and held his hand and stayed with him until help arrived, a single point of gentleness in the worst night of his life. She would remain a quiet presence in his story ever after, one of the very few people who knew the frightened child beneath the grim adult, and who worried always that his war would one day consume him. It is one of the tenderer threads in the mythology, easy to overlook, that even in his origin there was someone who simply sat with him in his grief, standing at his parents' graves, or kneeling in the dark, or alone in his suddenly enormous and echoing house. The boy made a vow, and though the exact words have been written many ways over the years, the heart of them never changes. He swore by the memory of his mother and father that he would spend the rest of his life at war with the kind of evil that had taken them, that he would give up every ordinary happiness and every ordinary comfort to make sure no other child would ever have to kneel in the dark the way he had. It is a terrible promise for a grieving child to make, and part of the quiet sorrow of the whole legend is that he keeps it, faithfully and completely, for the rest of his days, long after anyone could reasonably ask it of him. The final piece of the transformation, the moment the grief becomes a symbol, came years later, when the grown man sat alone in his study, wondering what shape to give his war, what disguise could strike fear into the hearts of the cruel and cowardly men he meant to fight. And as he sat there, in the most famous telling, a great bat came crashing through the tall window out of the night and settled before him in the gloom, and he took it as a kind of omen, a sign, and thought to himself that criminals are a superstitious and cowardly lot, and that he would become a creature of the night to haunt them, a living shadow, a bat. The fear that had lived in him since childhood was turned, deliberately and coldly, into a weapon he could aim at others. And Batman was born not out of the murder itself, but out of that quiet decision to make his own terror serve him. Before any of that, though, came the years that few of the stories dwell on. The long and lonely apprenticeship. The decade or more the young man spent travelling the world in secret, teaching himself everything a person could possibly need to wage such a war. He is said to have studied the martial arts of a dozen countries under a dozen masters, and forensic science and chemistry, and the crafts of the escape artist and the master of disguise, and criminology, and the reading of the smallest and most easily missed clues, driving himself without mercy until he had made himself into perhaps the finest hand-to-hand fighter, and certainly one of the finest detectives alive. He learned to pick any lock and fly any aircraft and speak many languages and vanish from a locked room, and he did it all not out of joy, but out of that single relentless purpose that never once let him rest. It is worth pausing on that word, detective, because for all the gadgets and the fighting and the fearsome costume, that is what he most truly is, and it is no accident that the very comic he first appeared in was called Detective Comics. He is called, again and again across the decades, the world's greatest detective, and his sharpest weapon has always been his mind, his ability to look at a room full of nothing and see the one small thing that everyone else has missed, to think 3 or 4 steps ahead of the cleverest criminals in the world. The fights are only ever the end of the story. The real work, the thing he is best at in all the world, is the quiet, patient unravelling of a mystery in the dark. What makes all of this the more remarkable is that, unlike so many of the heroes who stand beside him, he has no powers at all, not one. He cannot fly or lift a car or shrug off bullets. He is only a man, mortal and breakable, held together by discipline and will and years of punishing preparation, and every single thing he can do is, at least in theory, a thing a determined human being could learn to do. That has always been a quiet part of his particular magic and his particular loneliness, the sense that he stands among gods as an ordinary person who simply refuses, night after night, to be less than he has made himself, running always on nothing more than stubbornness and grief. Out of that grief grew the single rule that matters more to him than any other, the one line he will not cross no matter what is done to him or those he loves, and it is this, that he will never take a life, and never ever use a gun. A gun took his parents from him in that alley, and he has hated the things ever since, with a deep and personal loathing, and so he fights his whole endless war without ever killing, capturing even the most monstrous of his enemies and handing them over to be locked away rather than ending them. It costs him terribly, this rule, for many of those enemies escape and kill again, and he knows it, and still he holds the line, because he understands that the moment he allows himself to kill, even once, even for the best of reasons, the grieving child in the alley would be lost for good, and he would become the very thing he has given his whole life to fighting. The city he gave his life to protect has a name with a strange and fitting history of its own. Bill Finger is said to have chosen it almost by chance, flipping through a telephone directory and landing on the name of a jeweller, Gotham, and borrowing the word for the shadowed metropolis he needed. But the word was far older than that, an old and half-forgotten nickname for the great city of New York, coined more than a century earlier by a famous American author, who had drawn it in turn from the name of an English village whose people, in an old folk tale, once escaped the notice of a king by all pretending to be mad. A town of wise fools feigning madness to be left in peace. It is a strangely perfect route for a place so full of beautiful lunacy, and almost no one who lives there ever knows it. Gotham City grew over the decades into almost a character in its own right. A place of perpetual night and Gothic spires and rain-slicked streets. A dark and exaggerated mirror of every frightening and lonely thing about a real city. It is always winter there, or so it seems, always raining, always teetering one storm away from drowning in its own corruption, and its architecture leans and looms in a way no real cities does, all gargoyles and narrow alleys and bridges vanishing into fog. Batman is in many ways simply the grief and the stubbornness of that city given a human shape, its refusal to lie down and die, and the two of them, the man and the place, can no longer really be imagined apart. On the edge of the city, in most tellings, stands the great house where the man himself was born and raised, an enormous old manor set on grounds of its own, passed down through generations of the family, full of long corridors and cold rooms and the ghosts of a happier time. It is called Wayne Manor, and to the world it is simply the grand home of a careless millionaire, but beneath it, hidden away, lies the true heart of his whole operation. For running deep under the house is a vast natural cavern, discovered in one beloved telling, when the young Bruce fell through the earth as a boy and tumbled down into the dark, into a great cave full of bats, the very thing he would later take as his symbol. That cavern became the Batcave, one of the most wonderful spaces in all of fiction. A secret world beneath the mansion, where the crime fighter keeps everything he needs and hides everything he is. It is part laboratory and part garage and part museum, lined with towering computers and forensic equipment, home to his vehicles and his costumes, and famously decorated with enormous trophies from his old cases. Souvenirs that give the place a strange and lonely grandeur. There is a giant penny and a huge mechanical dinosaur and an oversized playing card left behind by his greatest enemy, each one a monument to a story, so that the whole cave becomes a kind of quiet gallery of his own long history, a museum with an audience of one. Around him, over the years, he assembled an arsenal of tools that became as famous as the man himself, though he never carries a single lethal weapon among them. At his waist he wears the utility belt, a simple line of pouches and compartments that has, over the decades, been shown to hold an almost impossible variety of gadgets, everything he might conceivably need on a given night. From lockpicks to smoke pellets to small explosives to a breathing device, all of it non-lethal, all of it chosen with a detective's careful foresight. The belt is a quiet joke among fans for always containing exactly the strange item a situation requires, but that, in its way, is the whole point of him, that he is a man who has thought ahead about everything. The most beloved of his tools may be the batarang, a folding throwing weapon shaped like a bat, its wings curved so that it flies true and, like the boomerang it is named for, can be made to return. He uses it to disarm, to strike from a distance, to swing across gaps and snag high ledges, and its silhouette has become almost as iconic as the cowl itself. Alongside it he carries a grapple, a line he fires to catch the tops of buildings and haul himself up into the dark, so that he can move across the rooftops of the city like the creature he pretends to be, appearing and vanishing, always above, always watching, never quite where his enemies expect him. And then there is the car. The Batmobile has taken 100 shapes across the years, from a simple red sedan in the very earliest stories, to the long-finned monsters of the television age, to the armoured, tank-like machines of the modern films. But it is always unmistakably his, low and black and menacing, bristling with defences and built for speed. It is one of the most famous vehicles ever imagined, real or fictional, and it has been joined over the decades by a whole fleet of others, aircraft and boats and cycles, but the car is the one that lives in everyone's imagination, the black shape tearing through the rain-soaked streets with its engine howling in the dark. Above all of it, though, hangs the most poetic of his tools, the one that is less a weapon than a promise, and that is the great light on the roof of police headquarters, the signal that throws the shape of a bat against the low clouds over the city whenever he is needed. It was created by his allies in the police as a way to call him out of the shadows, and it has become one of the most recognisable symbols in the world, that bat shape burning against the night, a strange and beautiful thing when you stop to think about it, an entire city with a way to reach up into the dark and ask its guardian angel to come. For the frightened and the desperate, that light is hope. For the guilty, it is the first cold touch of fear. For all his loneliness, the man in the cave is not entirely alone, and the first and most faithful of the people who stand beside him is an elderly English butler named Alfred Pennyworth. Alfred did not appear in the very earliest stories, but arrived a few years in, and in a lovely bit of history his look actually changed because of the movies, for when an early film serial cast a thin, mustached actor as the butler, the comics quietly redrew their once portly and clean-shaven Alfred to match, and the slim, dry, impeccably dignified figure we know today was born on the screen before he settled into the page. he has been, ever since, the quiet heart of the whole legend. Alfred is far more than a servant, and that is the tenderness of him. In most tellings he raised Bruce after the murder, becoming the closest thing the orphaned boy had to a parent, and he serves now as the crime fighter's confidant and conscience and field medic, stitching his wounds in the small hours, keeping the great house running, offering a dry remark exactly when it is needed, and worrying, always worrying, about the man he loves like a son. He is often the only voice willing to tell Batman the truth, to question the war, to remind him gently that he is still a human being who is allowed to grieve and to rest, and in a story so full of darkness, he is a small, steady lamp that never quite goes out. In time, the lonely crusade gathered others, and chief among them came a series of young partners, each one wearing the bright colours and the single name of Robin, a name chosen in the classic telling, in honour of Robin Hood and drawn from the robin that heralds the spring. The first was a boy named Dick Grayson, and his own story begins, like Bruce's, in tragedy, for he was the youngest of a family of circus acrobats called the Flying Graysons, and he watched his mother and father fall to their deaths when their trapeze was sabotaged by a gangster. Batman, recognising his own grief in the orphaned boy, took him in and gave him a purpose so that his sorrow would not curdle the way his own once had. Dick Grayson became the very first Robin in 1940, and the character was created in part to soften Batman, to give him someone to talk to, and to give younger readers someone to see themselves in, and it worked, for the bright laughing boy at the grim man's side became enormously popular almost at once. But Dick did not stay a boy forever, and one of the loveliest long arcs in all of comics is the story of how he grew up, stepped out from under Batman's shadow, and became a hero in his own right under a new name, Nightwing, no longer the sidekick but a man fully grown, beloved in his own city, in many ways warmer and more whole than the mentor who raised him. He is proof, quietly, that the cycle of grief can be broken, that a child taken in from the dark can grow into the light. There would be other Robins after him, and their stories run from the joyful to the devastating. The second boy to wear the costume was named Jason Todd, a rougher, angrier street kid Batman found trying to steal the tyres off the Batmobile, and his story took one of the darkest turns the character has ever known. In a famous and genuinely unsettling storyline near the end of the 1980s, the publishers left Jason's fate up to the readers, setting up a telephone vote in which fans could call one of two numbers to decide whether the boy would live or die, and by a slim and haunting margin the callers chose death. And so the second Robin was killed, beaten with a crowbar and lost in an explosion by Batman's greatest enemy, and his memory became a wound the Dark Knight carried for years, a glass case in the cave holding the empty costume, a reminder of the one he could not save. Jason's story did not end in that grave, however, for years later the comics brought him back, resurrected and transformed by rage into a darker figure called the Red Hood, a violent anti-hero who took up the very gun Batman refused to touch and set about fighting crime by killing it. His return became one of the most powerful explorations of Batman's great rule, for here was a son come back from the dead to demand why his killer was still allowed to live, why Batman would not simply end the monster who had murdered him, and the anguished argument between them cuts to the very centre of who the Dark Knight is. It is a story about grief and mercy and the terrible cost of holding a line, and it does not offer any easy answers. The third boy to take up the mantle was Tim Drake, and he came to it not through tragedy but through deduction, for in his story he was a clever child who worked out Batman's secret identity entirely on his own, simply by paying attention, and who then sought the grieving hero out because he could see that Batman had grown darker and more dangerous without a Robin at his side, and that the man needed a partner to keep him human. Tim was perhaps the most naturally gifted detective of all the Robins, a worthy heir to the world's greatest detective, and his quiet arrival says something gentle and true about the whole idea of the partnership. That the boy in the bright cape was never really there to protect Batman's body so much as his soul. And then there is the strangest and most striking of them all, a boy named Damian Wayne, who is, in the modern stories, Batman's own son. He is the child of Bruce and the daughter of one of his great enemies, raised in secret from birth by a league of assassins to be a perfect killer, and delivered to his father as a cold, arrogant, deadly little boy who had been taught that mercy was weakness. The long, difficult, deeply moving story of Damian slowly learning to be a hero rather than a murderer. Of a father and a son who barely know each other trying to bridge the terrible distance between them, has become one of the richest threads in recent decades. A war story that is really, underneath, about a man trying to give his own child the childhood that was stolen from him. The bright cape has been worn by others still, including at least one girl, a brave young woman named Stephanie Brown, who took up the mantle for a time, and the very idea of Robin has become something larger than any one child, a role passed from hand to hand down the years, a torch of hope handed on. Together with Batman, all these young partners and former partners form what fans lovingly call the Bat Family, and there is something quietly beautiful in that name. For a man who lost his family in an alley as a child has spent his whole life, perhaps without ever quite admitting it, slowly and stubbornly building himself a new one out of other lost and grieving children. Beyond the Robins stands another beloved figure, a young woman named Barbara Gordon, who first fought crime as Batgirl, donning a costume of her own and proving herself every bit the equal of the men around her. Her story too took a devastating turn, for in a famous and controversial tale, the Joker shot her through the spine, leaving her unable to walk. And rather than let that be the end of her, the writers did something remarkable and turned her into a new kind of hero altogether. Confined to a wheelchair, she became Oracle, the all-seeing information broker at the heart of the whole heroic community, a master hacker and strategist whose mind reached everywhere, and in doing so she became, for countless readers, a rare and powerful symbol that a disability need not be the end of a heroic life. Barbara is the daughter of another of the most important people in the whole mythology, Commissioner James Gordon, the honest policeman who stands almost alone against the corruption of Gotham's police force, and who becomes, over the years, Batman's truest ally on the right side of the law. Gordon is a good and weary and deeply human man, often the only clean officer in a dirty department, and his quiet partnership with the vigilante he is technically supposed to arrest is one of the great friendships of the mythology. Two exhausted men doing an impossible job, meeting on the rooftop by the great light, and trusting each other in a city where trust is hard to come by. In one lovely and recurring idea, Gordon has quietly guessed who Batman really is, and simply chosen never to look, preferring the hope the mask offers to the truth beneath it. There is one more quiet ally worth naming, a man called Lucius Fox, the brilliant and honest businessman who runs the Wayne family company, and who, in many versions, secretly supplies the crime fighter with much of his remarkable equipment, the armour and the vehicles and the impossible gadgets, all developed under the cover of a corporation. He is a reminder that behind the lone figure on the rooftop stands a whole quiet web of people who make the war possible, and that the man who seems to work in total solitude is, in truth, held up by the loyalty and the love of a handful of good souls who have chosen, each for their own reasons, to keep his terrible secret and to help him carry his terrible burden. No hero is remembered without his enemies, and it is often said that Batman has the single greatest rogues gallery in all of fiction, a whole city's worth of brilliant and broken and frightening people, and towering over every one of them stands the Joker. He appeared almost at the very beginning, in the first issue of Batman's own comic in the spring of 1940, a ghastly grinning figure with chalk-white skin and green hair and a permanent rictus smile. And in a small piece of history that says everything about him, he was meant to be killed off in that very first story, and was saved only when an editor stepped in at the last moment and insisted that so striking a villain be kept alive. That single decision gave the world its greatest villain, snatched, fittingly, from the very edge of death. The exact origins of the Joker, both within the stories and behind them, are wrapped in deliberate uncertainty, and that is part of his power. Behind the scenes, the credit for creating him has been quietly disputed for decades among the men who were there, each remembering it differently, and it has never been fully and finally settled who first dreamed him up, so that even his authorship is a kind of riddle. His look is often traced to a haunting old silent film about a man whose face had been carved into a permanent grin, and to a simple playing card, the Joker in the deck, the wild card that can be anything, and both of those images feel exactly right for a character who is chaos itself given a human face. Within the stories, his beginnings are kept just as murky, and this is a rare case where the vagueness is the whole point. The most famous version has him fall, as an ordinary man, into a vat of chemicals at a factory, the toxic brew bleaching his skin white and turning his hair green and his lips red, and some say breaking whatever was left of his mind. But the character himself, in one celebrated telling, says that he can never quite remember his own past, that if he must have a history he prefers it to be multiple choice, and Batman, for all his detective's genius, has never been able to learn the man's real name. He is a villain with no origin you can trust, and no true face beneath the paint, a blank and grinning void, and that unknowability makes him far more frightening than any tidy backstory ever could. What makes the Joker the perfect enemy is that he is the exact opposite of Batman in every way that matters. Where Batman is grim, disciplined, orderly and devoted to a single unbreakable rule, the Joker is gleeful, random, chaotic, and bound by nothing at all. He does not want money or power in any ordinary sense. What he wants, in the deepest tellings, is to prove that the whole idea of goodness and order is a joke, that anyone at all can be broken and made as mad as he is if they have one bad enough day, and Batman is the great living argument against that terrible thesis. The one good man he can never quite break, which is precisely why he can never leave him alone. Their war is not really about crime at all. It is a war of ideas, a lifelong argument about whether the world means anything. The two of them are locked together in a strange and terrible dependence, and both of them seem to know it. The Joker has murdered countless people, including at least one Robin, and has crippled and tormented those Batman loves, and yet Batman will not kill him, holding to his one great rule even here, even against the one enemy the whole world would forgive him for ending. It is the ultimate test of who he is, and the Joker knows it, and taunts him with it, and in some ways the clown's greatest victory is simply that he has forced his enemy to keep him alive, to become, in a sense, his protector. There is no relationship in all of comics quite like it. Two men who complete each other, the perfect order and the perfect chaos, forever circling in the dark. Standing near the Joker in the Gallery of the Broken is a man who was once one of the finest and most upright people in the whole city, and whose fall is perhaps the most tragic of them all. His name is Harvey Dent, and he was Gotham's brave young district attorney, a golden figure who fought the mob in the courts as Batman fought them in the streets, one of the crime fighter's dearest friends and truest allies, a man who seemed to represent everything good the city could still become. But a mob boss threw acid in his face during a trial, scarring one half of his features into a horror while the other half remained untouched. And the trauma shattered his mind along the same line, splitting him into the villain called Two-Face. The tragedy of Two-Face is that he was destroyed not by evil, but by the collision of his own great goodness with a cruelty he could not survive, and everything about him afterward is built around division. The good half and the ruined half, the man he was and the monster he became. He makes his decisions, famously, by flipping a scarred silver coin, surrendering himself entirely to chance because he can no longer trust his own broken judgment between right and wrong. And there is something almost unbearably sad in that. A man who once stood for justice, now letting a spinning coin decide who lives and who dies. Batman never gives up on him, never stops believing that the good Harvey is still in there somewhere, and that stubborn, grieving hope for a lost friend is one of the quietest and most human things about him. Not all of his great foes are so purely tragic, and one of them is not really an enemy at all so much as something far more complicated. Her name is Selina Kyle, and as Catwoman she is a burglar and a jewel thief, a creature of the night in her own right, prowling the same rooftops as the Dark Knight, and from her very first appearance, also in that same first issue back in 1940, there was a spark between them, a pull that neither one has ever quite been able to resist. Their long, winding, on and off romance is one of the great love stories of the whole mythology. Two lonely people who understand the shadows in each other, forever drawn together, and forever kept apart by the thin, uncrossable line between the law and the crime she cannot quite give up. Rounding out the oldest and most famous of his enemies are two more who appeared in those very early years and never left. There is the Penguin, a short, round, umbrella-wielding gentleman of crime named Oswald Cobblepot, obsessed with birds and with respectability, one of the few of Batman's foes who is entirely sane, a cold and clever crook rather than a madman. And there is the Riddler, Edward Nygma, a criminal cursed with a compulsion he cannot control, an overwhelming need to leave clues and riddles and puzzles behind at the scene of his every crime, practically daring Batman to catch him, which of course, given that he is facing the world's greatest detective, tends not to end well for him. Between the clown and the coin, and the cat and the bird and the puzzle maker, the shape of Batman's strange and tragic world was set very early, and it has only deepened since. The gallery runs far deeper than those first famous few, and many of its finest figures play, in one way or another, on the theme of fear that sits at the very centre of the whole legend. There is the Scarecrow, once a mild and bullied professor of psychology named Jonathan Crane, obsessed his whole life with fear, who turned that obsession into a weapon, developing a toxin that fills its victims with their own most private terrors, so that they see their worst nightmares made real before their eyes. It is a beautifully fitting enemy for a man who built himself entirely out of fear, out of turning his own childhood terror into a weapon, and their battles become, again and again, the strange duel between two men who have each spent their lives studying the same dark thing. There is Poison Ivy, a woman named Pamela Isley, transformed by science into something half human and half plant. Able to control growing things and to bend people to her will with intoxicating toxins, a creature who loves the green and growing world so fiercely that she has come to hate the human beings who poison it. She is a villain, but a strange and sympathetic one, driven by a love of nature twisted into something deadly, and in recent years the tender, complicated friendship between her and another of Batman's foes has become one of the most beloved relationships in all of comics, a rare thread of warmth running quietly through the darkness of the gallery. Perhaps the most quietly heartbreaking of all his enemies is a man named Victor Freeze, who fights the world in a suit of ice and is known as Mr. Freeze. For most of his early history he was a forgettable villain, a man who could only survive at freezing temperatures, until a single animated episode reinvented him completely and gave him one of the saddest stories the character has ever carried. In that telling, he was a scientist whose beloved wife, Nora, was dying of an incurable illness, and who froze her in the hope of one day finding a cure, only to have the experiment destroyed and his own body ruined so that he could never again feel warmth, physically or otherwise. His crimes, ever after, are all in service of the frozen woman he loves and cannot save, and his cold, grieving heart made a joke of a villain into a figure of genuine tragedy. From farther afield comes one of Batman's most dangerous and philosophical foes, an ancient man called Ra's al Ghul, whose name means the head of the demon, and who has lived for centuries by bathing in strange restorative pools called Lazarus Pits that heal his body and renew his youth, but leave him, each time, briefly and dangerously mad. He commands a global league of assassins and dreams of saving the natural world by wiping out most of humanity, and he is one of the very few enemies who has deduced Batman's true identity, whom he regards, unsettlingly, not with hatred, but with admiration, as the only man worthy to marry his daughter and inherit his empire. That daughter, Talia, loves the Dark Knight deeply and tragically, caught forever between her devotion to her terrible father and her love for his greatest enemy. And their doomed romance produced the son, Damian, who would one day become Robin. One enemy stands apart for having done what none of the others ever quite managed, and his name is Bane. A brute of monstrous size made stronger still by a drug called venom that pumps through tubes into his body, Bane is often underestimated as mere muscle, but he is in truth a brilliant and patient strategist, and in a famous storyline he did the unthinkable. He worked out that the way to destroy Batman was not to fight him fresh, but to exhaust him first, and so he emptied out the asylum and set every one of Batman's enemies loose upon the city at once, and let the Dark Knight run himself into the ground, recapturing them all. And only then, when the man was utterly spent, did Bane confront him and break his back and leave him broken. It remains one of the most shocking things ever done to the character, the night his spine was snapped and his war very nearly ended for good. Not every figure in the gallery is a source of dread, and one of them began as a joke and became something far more. Her name is Harley Quinn, and unlike almost all the others, she was born not in the comics, but on television, created for the animated series in the early 1990s as a giggling henchwoman for the Joker, and she proved so instantly beloved that she leapt off the screen and into the comics, and eventually into the wider world. becoming one of the most popular characters the franchise has ever produced. Her real story, though, is a dark one, beneath the bright colours, for she was once a bright young psychiatrist named Harleen Quinzel, who was assigned to treat the Joker, and was instead seduced and manipulated and broken by him, drawn into a poisonous love that nearly destroyed her. And much of her long arc since has been the slow, difficult, genuinely moving story of a woman clawing her way free of an abuser and learning, at last, to stand on her own. The gallery holds stranger things still, figures who blur the line between villain and monster. There is Clayface, a man of living clay who can reshape himself into any form at all, a shapeshifter of endless faces and no true face of his own. There is Man-Bat, a scientist named Kirk Langstrom, who transformed himself into a monstrous winged creature, a dark and tragic mirror of Batman's own chosen symbol. There is the Mad Hatter, a small, disturbed man obsessed with a children's book and with mind-controlling hats, and the Ventriloquist, a timid soul who commits terrible crimes through a wooden gangster puppet he seems to believe is truly alive, and Killer Croc, a man cursed with a reptilian condition that has slowly turned him into something scaled and savage and cast out. Each of them, in their own way, is a study in transformation and loneliness, in what it means to be turned by the world into a monster. Almost all of these broken people end up again and again in a single terrible place, a crumbling old institution on the edge of the city called Arkham Asylum, where the criminally insane of Gotham are sent, and from which they endlessly, inevitably escape. Arkham is one of the great settings of the whole mythology, a gothic madhouse as haunted and troubled as any of its inmates, a revolving door through which the Joker and all the rest pass on their way back into the world, and there is a deep and unspoken sadness woven through the very idea of it, for it is the place where Batman's refusal to kill leads. He captures his enemies rather than ending them, and hands them to Arkham, and Arkham cannot hold them, and so the cycle turns on, the same broken people caught and lost and caught again. Forever, there is a whole further crowd of them beyond even these, more than almost any other hero can claim, from an early foe called Hugo Strange, who was among the very first to uncover Batman's secret, to a cold and precise enemy called Hush, who came wrapped in bandages and old friendship, to the sinister and ancient Court of Owls, a secret society said to have ruled the city from the shadows for centuries, while Batman, who believed he knew every corner of his own city, never once suspected they were there. That last discovery cut him deeply. The realization that the place he thought he understood better than anyone had been keeping an enormous secret from him all along, and it stands as a quiet reminder that even the world's greatest detective can be humbled, that even he does not truly know everything about the dark city he has given his life to protect. The Batman we have been drifting through, grim and gothic and haunted, has not always been the Batman on the page, and one of the quiet pleasures of his long history is watching him change shape with the times. In his very first years he was a dark and even murderous figure of the night, but as the 1940s wore on and his readership grew younger, he softened, brightened, took on a boy partner and a friendly butler, and became something more like a wholesome adventurer, a daylight hero as much as a creature of shadow. And then, in the middle of the 1950s, the whole medium was struck by a storm that would change him more strangely still. That storm came in the form of a book by a crusading psychiatrist, published in 1954, which argued that comic books were corrupting the youth of the nation, and which singled out Batman in particular for an accusation that would trail the character for decades, suggesting that the bond between the grown man and his young ward carried an unwholesome undertone. The book helped ignite a genuine moral panic, complete with government hearings, and the frightened comics industry responded by binding itself with a strict code of self-censorship that governed what the stories could and could not show for years to come. It is strange to think that the shadowy world of Batman was reshaped not by any writer's vision, but by a wave of public fear about the innocence of children. The industry's response to those accusations left its fingerprints all over the character in odd and lasting ways. In part to answer the whispers and give the household a wholesome, conventional shape, the comics introduced a whole new supporting cast of women, a glamorous heroine called Batwoman, and later a younger Batgirl, brought in largely to provide romantic interest and to quiet the rumours. They introduced, too, a loyal dog named Ace who wore a little mask of his own and helped fight crime, so that the strange-found family of the cave grew stranger still, and for a time the once lonely Avenger of the Night presided over something closer to a bustling, brightly coloured clubhouse. The strangeness reached its peak in the years that followed, in a period so gloriously bizarre that it still delights fans who stumble upon it. To keep up with the science fiction craze of the age, the down-to-earth detective was flung into the wildest possible adventures, battling aliens and travelling through time and being transformed in various issues into a giant or a genie or a rainbow-coloured version of himself, or any number of other absurd things. He even gained for a while a tiny, adoring imp from another dimension called Batmite, a magical creature who idolised him and who would pop into reality to cause chaos out of pure affection. It was Batman at his silliest and most surreal, about as far from the grim Avenger of the Night as it is possible to imagine, and there is a real charm in it, a reminder that this most serious of heroes has, buried in his past, an era of pure and delightful nonsense. That whole zany, colourful spirit found its most famous expression not on the page but on the television screen, in a show that would define Batman for an entire generation and that still shapes how much of the world pictures him. Arriving in the middle of the 1960s, it was a bright, campy, tongue-in-cheek comedy that took the absurdity of the era and turned it up as high as it would go, full of garish colours and cheerful fistfights with the word POW spelled out on the screen, of ludicrous gadgets all labelled with the word BAT, of a hero who solemnly obeyed every traffic law and lectured his young partner on the virtues of eating vegetables. It was played completely straight by its leading man, which only made it funnier, and audiences adored it. That show gave the world some of its most enduring images of the character, and a great deal of the affectionate silliness people still associate with him, from the earnest cries of holy this and holy that, to the ridiculous labelled gadgets, to a famous scene involving a comically stubborn shark and a can of spray. It ran for only a few years but burned itself permanently into the culture, and for a long time afterward, to much of the general public, Batman simply was that bright and jolly figure, a source of gentle laughter rather than fear, so much so that the comics themselves spent years afterward deliberately hauling the character back toward the darkness, trying to remind the world that he had begun as a creature of the night and could be one again. There is a lovely small piece of history tucked inside that television era, concerning the actor who played the Joker, a suave older performer who took the part with obvious glee. He refused, however, to shave off his own moustache for the role, and so the makeup artist simply painted the clown's white grease paint straight over it, meaning that if you look closely at the grinning villain of that show, you can still see the faint outline of the actor's real moustache showing through beneath the paint. It is the kind of small, human, faintly absurd detail that makes the history of the character so warm to wander through, a reminder that behind even the most iconic images are ordinary people making do, refusing to shave, showing up to work in the grease paint and having a wonderful time. The pull back toward the darkness, when it came in earnest, arrived through a handful of comics in the 1980s so powerful that they reshaped not only Batman, but the whole idea of what a superhero story could be. The first and most thunderous of them imagined an older Batman, retired and grey and bitter, dragged out of a long and unhappy retirement to fight one last war in a decaying near-future city. It gave the character a weight and a grimness he had not carried in decades, showing him as a force of terrifying while pushed almost to the edge of madness, and its influence on everything that followed can hardly be overstated. It reminded the world all at once that this was not a jolly figure in a bright cape, but something far heavier and stranger, an old man's rage and grief made flesh. Close beside it came another slim and quiet masterpiece, a retelling of the very beginning, of the crime fighter's first fumbling year in the costume, and the honest young policeman arriving in the same corrupt city at the same time. Their two lonely struggles slowly converging. It stripped the legend back to its bones, made it feel grounded and real and human. A story of two ordinary men trying to do an impossible thing in a city that did not want to be saved, and it has become, for many readers, the definitive account of how it all began. The template that so many later films and stories would reach for when they wanted to tell the origin again. Then there was a single devastating story that has hung over the character ever since. A short and brutal tale in which the Joker sets out to prove his grim philosophy that anyone at all can be driven mad by one sufficiently terrible day. To make his point, he commits an act of shocking cruelty against Commissioner Gordon and his daughter, the shooting that would put Barbara in her wheelchair, and the whole thing becomes a meditation on madness and trauma and the thin line between the hero and the villain. It ends on one of the most famous and most debated final moments in all of comics, the two enemies standing together in the rain, and it has never quite stopped troubling readers, which is perhaps exactly what it was meant to do. The darkening continued into the stories we have already touched. The terrible night the second Robin was killed by Rita Vogt, the long ordeal of Bane breaking the hero's back, and the desperate months of recovery that followed, and it deepened too in quieter and more elegant ways. There were long, moody detective stories that returned him to his roots as a solver of mysteries, sprawling year-long tales of a single unsolved series of holiday murders that slowly, patiently unravel, while the young district attorney Harvey Dent begins his terrible slide toward becoming Two-Face. These were stories that trusted the reader to sit in the shadows and think, that understood the character was at his best not when he was punching, but when he was piecing together the truth in the dark. The modern decades brought new nightmares and new depths. There was the discovery of the ancient Court of Owls, the secret society that had haunted the city for centuries beneath Batman's very nose, a story that shook his certainty that he knew his own city better than anyone alive. And there was a strange and frightening idea born more recently, a twisted version of the Dark Knight himself imagined from a dark corner of the multiverse. A Batman who had finally broken his one great rule and killed the Joker, only to be infected by the dying clown's madness and fused with it, becoming a laughing monster with all of Batman's genius and none of his mercy. That grinning horror has become one of the most popular villains of the modern age, and there is a grim logic to it. The recognition that the single most terrifying thing imaginable is not any outside enemy at all, but Batman himself with his one restraint removed. for all the darkness, the comics have never entirely lost their tenderness, and some of the most beloved stories are the quiet, sad, beautiful ones. There is a famous imagined ending, a story that asks how the legend might finally close, that gathers his friends and his enemies together to tell the tale of his death and answers, in the end, that a man like this can never really be allowed to stop, that he will always get up and put the cowl back on and go out into the night one more time, because that is simply who he is. It is a strange comfort, that idea, both a blessing and a kind of sentence, the sense that the war has no ending, that the grieving child in the alley will keep his promise forever, and that somewhere, always, the light will keep burning on the roof, and the dark shape will keep answering it. Across all these stories, early and late, silly and grim, one quality endures and deepens, and it is the sense of Batman as a mind above all else, as the great planner. The man who is always 3 steps ahead, who has, famously, prepared a secret plan to defeat every one of his closest allies should they ever turn against the world, including the most powerful beings in existence. In one memorable tale, those very contingency plans are stolen and used against his friends, forcing a reckoning over how far his careful paranoia has gone. But the underlying truth of him remains, that his real superpower is preparation, foresight, the refusal ever to be caught unready. He treats the whole world as a mystery to be solved, and a disaster to be prevented, and he lies awake, so the stories suggest, thinking of every terrible thing that could happen, so that when it does, he will already know what to do. Beyond the page, Batman has lived a second and equally sprawling life on screens large and small, and tracing that history is like watching the same man reflected in a dozen different mirrors, each one shaped by its own age. He first stepped off the page during the 1940s, in cheap and creaky black and white film serials shown in installments at the cinema. And though those old chapters are clumsy by any modern measure, they matter more than their quality suggests, for it was there, as we have heard, that the thin and dignified new Alfred was born, and there that the underground headquarters was first called a cave, details that then travelled back into the comics and stayed. Even in his roughest and earliest screen appearances, the character was already quietly reshaping himself. Then came the bright and jolly television age of the 1960s, and after it, for a long while, a strange silence, as the character drifted back toward the shadows in the comics, but stayed away from the big screen. When he finally returned to cinemas at the very end of the 1980s, it was as something the general public had almost forgotten he could be. Dark and gothic and strange, in a film that deliberately buried the memory of the campy television show under gloom and gargoyles and shadow. It was a gamble, and there was genuine worry beforehand about whether audiences would accept so grim a version, but it became an enormous success, and it proved once and for all that the world was ready to take the Dark Knight seriously again. That film and its stranger, sadder sequel gave the world a brooding, haunted Batman moving through a nightmarish, half-fantastical city, and a Joker and later a Catwoman and a Penguin who have never quite been forgotten. The music alone became iconic, a dark and soaring orchestral theme that still instantly conjures the character, and the whole look of it, all shadow and art and menace, defined the cinematic Batman for years. But the films that followed slowly lost their way, growing brighter and sillier and more toy-like with each installment, until the series ended in a picture so garish and so mocked, so infamous for putting sculpted muscles and other absurdities onto the very Batsuit itself, that it managed to kill the whole franchise stone dead for the better part of a decade. It stands now as a strange monument to how badly the character can go wrong when the darkness at his core is forgotten. Out of that failure, eventually, came one of the great reinventions, when a thoughtful director rebuilt the character from the ground up in the middle of the 2000s, grounding him in a realism so careful that the whole thing felt almost plausible, as though a real and very driven man might actually do this. That trilogy of films took the origin seriously, showing the years of training and the slow, deliberate building of the symbol, and it gave the world a Batman of genuine weight and pain. Its second chapter in particular, built around the Joker, is regarded by many as one of the finest films the whole superhero genre has ever produced. Elevated by a performance of such frightening, chaotic brilliance that it has become legendary. There is a real and lasting sorrow woven through that celebrated performance, for the young actor who played the Joker, who threw himself so completely into the role and disappeared so utterly into that grinning chaos, died at just 28 before the film was even released, from an accidental overdose of prescription medication. He was awarded posthumously the industry's highest honour for the performance, a rare thing for this kind of film, and his portrayal of the character has hung over every version since, admired and mourned in equal measure. It is one of the quieter tragedies attached to the whole legend. A brilliant young man who gave everything to bring the clown to life, and did not live to see the world fall in love with what he had done. Since that trilogy, the character has been reimagined yet again more than once, worn by different actors in a shared universe of heroes, brooding and older and more brutal in one incarnation, and then, more recently, made young and raw and grief-stricken again in a rain-soaked detective story that leaned harder into the idea of him as the world's greatest detective than any film before it, following him through only his second year in the costume, still uncertain, still more a creature of vengeance than the polished legend he would become. Each new version finds something different in him, emphasises a different facet, and that is part of why he endures. Because he is somehow large enough and simple enough to hold all of these readings at once, the campy and the gothic, and the grounded and the grieving, without any one of them ever feeling like the whole of him. What is remarkable, looking across all of it, is how few of the essential pieces ever really change from mirror to mirror. The parents always die in the alley, the pearls always scatter, the bat always comes through the window, or its equivalent. The vow is always made, the cave is always found, the faithful butler always waits, the clown always laughs. You can strip away the tone and the setting and the decade and the actor, and underneath it all the same small unbearable story is always there. A child who lost everything and turned his grief into a shield for others, and that, more than any gadget or any villain, is the thing that has kept him alive and beloved across so many generations and so many forms. For a great many people, though, the truest Batman of all was never in the comics or the live-action films, but in animation, in a single beloved cartoon that arrived in the early 1990s and is still spoken of, by those who grew up with it, with a kind of reverence. It was unlike any cartoon before it, painted on dark paper so that the shadows came first, and the light was added on top, giving the whole thing a moody, timeless, film noir beauty, and it treated its young audience as though they could handle real sorrow and real complexity, which, it turned out, they could. It took the character more seriously in some ways than any version before or since, and it remains for many the definitive telling, the one against which all the others are quietly measured. That series gave the world two voices that have become, for a whole generation, the true sound of these characters. The Dark Knight was voiced by an actor whose deep, calm, gentle yet commanding tone came to be regarded as the definitive Batman voice, so beloved that he returned to the role again and again for the better part of 30 years, across show after show and game after game. And the Joker was voiced by a performer already famous as a heroic figure in a galaxy far away, who reinvented himself completely as the clown, giving him a wild, cackling, endlessly inventive laugh that became just as iconic as the hero's voice, the two of them forever linked, the calm dark and the shrieking light, in the ears of everyone who grew up listening to them. There is a real and recent sadness here, for the actor who gave Batman his voice for all those decades, who was for so many people simply the sound of the character in their own heads, passed away a few years ago, and the outpouring of grief was enormous and genuine, a whole generation mourning a voice that had been part of the furniture of their childhoods. He had come over the years to speak movingly about what the role and the character meant to him, and there was a sense when he died that something irreplaceable had gone, that no matter who took up the part after him, that particular voice, that particular calm in the dark, would never come again. It is a reminder that these characters, for all that they are drawings and fictions, are carried into the world by real and mortal people whom we come to love. That same animated world produced, among many other treasures, a genuinely great feature film, a melancholy story of a lost love from Bruce Wayne's past, and the terrible choice between his own happiness and the vow he had made, one of the most emotionally rich things the character has ever appeared in. And it produced too a remarkable vision of the future, a series set decades ahead in which an aged Bruce Wayne, long retired and alone, mentors a troubled teenage boy who takes up a new, sleeker version of the mantle, so that the legend passes on to a new generation. That glimpse of the old man in the empty house, still unable to let the mission die, handing the cowl at last to a successor, carries a deep and gentle sadness, meditation on aging and legacy, and the loneliness of a life given entirely to a single cause. Batman does not spend all his time alone in Gotham, of course, for he is also one of the founding members of the greatest team of heroes in his world, standing shoulder to shoulder with gods and aliens and demigods despite being, himself, only a man. There is something quietly wonderful in that image, the one ordinary human being in a room full of the impossibly powerful, and yet the others listen to him, and even in their private moments admit to fearing him a little, because they understand that his preparation and his will make him, in his own way, as formidable as any of them. He is the proof, standing among them, that a mortal with enough determination need not be small beside a god. His deepest bond among those heroes is with the very figure who inspired his own creation, the bright and hopeful last son of a dead world, and the friendship between the two of them, the dark and the light, the man of shadow and the man of the sun, is one of the oldest and richest in all of the medium. They are opposites in almost every way. The one who works in secret and inspires fear, and the one who works in the open and inspires hope, and they do not always agree, and have even in some stories come to blows, and yet beneath it all is a profound mutual respect. Two men who have each seen the very worst the world can do, and each chosen, in their own opposite ways, to stand against it. Together they are often called the world's finest, and there is a reason that pairing has endured for the better part of a century. The animated tradition never really stopped, running on through show after show across the decades, some of them dark and some of them light, and even in a few joyful cases, deliberately returning to the bright and silly spirit of the old television days, proving that all of his many moods can live at once. He has been reimagined for small children and for grown adults, made frightening and made funny, built out of shadow and built in one cheerful film, entirely out of plastic building blocks, and somehow he survives all of it intact. That may be the surest sign of how deep the character runs, that he can be a figure of genuine terror in one telling and a figure of pure comedy in the next, and remain, underneath, unmistakably himself in both. There is one more realm where the character found a strange and complete new life, and that is in video games, where for a long while superheroes had a poor and disappointing history, until a single game arrived near the end of the 2000s and changed everything. It set the Dark Knight loose for one long, nightmarish night inside the walls of the asylum itself, trapped with all his greatest enemies as the Joker seized control of the madhouse, and it understood something that so many earlier games had missed, that to be Batman is not only to fight, but to stalk, to hunt, to glide silently through the dark and pick your enemies off one by one until the last of them is left alone and afraid. It let players finally feel what it might be like to be the thing in the shadows, and it was a triumph. That game, and the larger ones that followed it, sending him out into a walled-off slice of the city, and then into the whole of Gotham on a single rain-soaked night, are regarded as some of the finest games ever built around any character at all, and they drew beautifully on everything that had come before, bringing back those same two beloved voices from the animated series to play the hero and the clown once more. For many younger fans, those games are how they first truly came to know the character, not by reading him or watching him, but by becoming him, by pulling the cowl over their own eyes and dropping down into the dark. And there is something fitting in that the most interactive of all the media should let a person step directly into the long loneliness of the mission. It is worth lingering, before we drift on the other half of him, on the face he shows the world in the daylight, because the double life is such a quiet and central part of who he is. To almost everyone in the city, he is not a grim avenger at all, but Bruce Wayne, a careless, charming, faintly ridiculous billionaire, a playboy who throws lavish parties and dates glamorous people and seems to care about nothing but his own pleasure, and he cultivates that image deliberately, wears it like a second costume, precisely because no one would ever suspect so shallow a man of being the creature on the rooftops. The foolish millionaire is one of his cleverest disguises, and there is something lonely in it, that he must spend his days pretending to be empty so that his nights can be full of purpose. Behind that frivolous mask, the family fortune and the vast company he inherited become quiet engines of his war, funding the equipment and the vehicles and the technology, and also, in his better moments, funding something gentler. For Bruce Wayne is in most tellings a genuine and generous philanthropist, pouring money through his family's charitable foundation into the very neighbourhoods that need it most, trying to heal the city by daylight in ways the cowl never could. It is a lovely and often overlooked truth about him, that some part of his war is fought not with fists at all, but with hospitals and shelters and schools, that the man who dresses as a bat to frighten criminals also quietly gives away fortunes to fix the conditions that create them. He is too a far more versatile figure than the grim image suggests, a master of disguise who can vanish into a crowd or slip into the criminal underworld wearing a whole other identity, and in a favourite recurring trick he has a long-standing false persona, a small-time crook he can become at will, complete with his own name and history, so that he can move among the gangs of the city as one of their own, and hear the things no vigilante ever could. It is a reminder that beneath the fear and the theatricality he is, first and always a detective, a gatherer of secrets, a man as comfortable playing a part in a smoky back room as he is descending on his enemies from the dark. The strange found family that gathered around him grew, over the years, far beyond the Robins and the first Batgirl, until the rooftops of the city seemed almost crowded with those who had taken up some version of his mission. There came another woman to wear the bat, a bold and striking heroine with a fierce sense of justice all her own, and a grim crossbow-wielding avenger who hunted the very mob that had slaughtered her family, and a silent, extraordinary young woman raised from birth by assassins to be a living weapon, who could barely speak at first, but could read a person's whole intention in the smallest shift of their body, and who chose, against everything she had been made for, to fight for life instead of death. Each of them found in the symbol of the bat something they needed, a shape to pour their own grief and their own resolve into. There is a cautionary tale buried in that widening family, from the dark days after Bane broke the hero's back, when Bruce, unable to continue, chose another man to take up the mantle in his absence, a troubled figure conditioned from birth toward violence. That replacement grew steadily more brutal and more unstable inside the costume, redesigning it into something armoured and bladed and frightening, abandoning the careful mercy at the character's core and drifting toward the very killing that Bruce had forever refused, until at last the healed and returned Bruce had to fight his own successor to take back the cowl. It stands as one of the mythology's quietest and sharpest lessons that the costume alone does not make the hero. But without the rule and the restraint and the grief held rightly, the symbol can curdle into something monstrous. In one of the grander and more hopeful ideas of recent decades, the hero took the notion of that widening family and made it deliberate and global, reasoning that he could not be everywhere at once, and that his true legacy should be not a man, but an idea that could be shared. And so he set about funding and training others across the whole world, franchising the symbol in a sense, so that many cities might have their own local guardian inspired by and connected to him, turning the lonely one-man war into something closer to a movement. It is a striking turn for so solitary a figure, the moment he seems to understand that the most powerful thing about him was never his fists or his fortune, but the symbol itself, and that a symbol, unlike a man, can be everywhere, and need never die. Because his stories have been told for so long and by so many hands, there have come to be countless versions of him scattered across imagined parallel worlds, and some of them are strange and haunting mirrors that reveal, by contrast, exactly what makes the true one who he is. In one of the most devastating, the timeline is bent so that it is the young Bruce who dies in the alley that night, and his grieving father who lives. And it is that father, Thomas Wayne, who becomes a Batman in his son's place, but a colder and more brutal one, who feels no need to spare the guilty, while the grieving mother, Martha, is driven mad by her son's death, and becomes, in that broken world, the Joker. It is almost unbearable to contemplate, that single altered moment rippling out into so complete a nightmare, and it throws the real family's tragedy into a strange and terrible new light. There are gentler oddities among the parallel selves as well, including a bizarre and beloved idea in which, pushed to the very edge of his mind by a psychological attack, the hero retreats into a backup personality he had secretly built long ago for exactly such an emergency, a stranger, wilder version of himself dressed in garish purple and red, a Batman for the day his own mind might be taken from him. It is a genuinely peculiar concept, and yet it is so very like him, so perfectly in character that even his own breakdown was something he had prepared for in advance, that even against the loss of his own sanity he had, years before, quietly built himself a contingency plan. The look of him has shifted quietly across the decades too, in ways long-time readers love to trace, and the symbol on his chest tells its own small story. For a long stretch of his history, beginning in the 1960s, the bat on his chest sat inside a bright yellow oval, a splash of colour meant to draw the eye, and whole generations grew up knowing him with that golden ring around the bat. Then, around the turn of the century, the oval quietly vanished again, and the bare black bat returned, closer to his earliest and starkest appearance, so that you can very nearly date a given image of him simply by glancing at his chest, by whether the bat floats alone in the dark or sits ringed in yellow. It is the kind of tiny, patient detail that rewards a slow and loving attention. Even death, that most final of things, has never been able to hold him for long, on the page or off it, and in one memorable modern epic he was believed killed only to be revealed as having been flung helplessly backward through time, scattered across the ages, so that his return became a journey home through the whole of history. It is a fittingly impossible fate for a character who simply refuses to end, and it rhymes with that gentle old idea we touched on earlier, that a man like this can never really be allowed to stop. That whatever befalls him, whatever the story does to him, he will always, somehow, get back up, put the cowl on once more, and go out again into the waiting night. It is worth pausing, near the end, simply to marvel at how enormous his shadow has grown across the ordinary world, far beyond the pages he was born in. The bat symbol is now among the most instantly recognised images on the entire planet, understood without a word in nearly every country on Earth, a simple black shape that means the same thing to a child in almost any language. He has been portrayed by more performers and appeared in more films and shows and games than very nearly any other character of his kind, has had entire days set aside to celebrate him, has sold more toys and shirts and posters than could ever be counted, and has become, in the truest sense, a piece of the shared furniture of the modern imagination, a figure almost everyone alive can picture, whether or not they have ever read a single one of his stories. And it all traces back, every bit of it, the billion-dollar films and the global symbol and the crowded family of heroes, to those two young men in their early 20s, working for a few dollars a page in the very last months before the world went to war, dreaming up a caped figure to chase a bright new market, never imagining that the strange thing they were making would outlive them both by generations and travel to every corner of the earth. There is a quiet wonder in that. The thought of so vast and lasting a thing growing from so small and ordinary a beginning, a whole mythology unfurling across a century out of a single 6-page story that cost a dime. Something should be said too about the sheer discipline the character demands of himself, the daily grinding cost of being what he has chosen to be, because it is easy to forget, amid the gadgets and the drama, just how punishing his life is meant to be. He is shown again and again as a man who sleeps only a few hours and often less, who trains his body relentlessly to hold it at the very peak of human possibility, who has studied so many fighting styles and so many fields of knowledge that he seems to have an answer for everything, who speaks many languages and can pilot almost anything and read almost any clue. He has made himself into a kind of instrument, tuned and honed and never allowed to rest. And the stories are honest in their better moments about what that costs a person, about the loneliness and the exhaustion and the slow wearing down of a body pushed forever past its limits. That toll deepens as the character ages, and the story's brave enough to let him age at all, for a life of falls and beatings and broken bones does not leave a body untouched. No matter how disciplined its owner, the older Batman of many tales is a mass of old injuries and stiffening joints and accumulated pain, a man running increasingly on will alone as his body begins at last to fail him. And there is something quietly moving in that image. The greatest of all the mortal heroes slowly discovering the one enemy that even he cannot out-train or out-think or out-prepare, which is time itself. He is only a man after all, and the years come for him as they come for everyone, and he keeps going anyway, which is perhaps the most human and the most heroic thing about him of all. His mind, at least, does not dim, and it is worth dwelling for a moment on just how formidable that mind is meant to be. For he is written not merely as clever, but as one of the sharpest intellects in his entire world, a strategist and a scientist and a detective of almost frightening ability. He is the one the most powerful beings in existence turn to when a problem cannot be solved by strength, the one who sees the pattern no one else can see, who notices the single detail that unravels the whole mystery, who has, unsettlingly, thought through in advance how he would defeat every ally and every enemy he has ever known. His genius is a quiet kind of power, less dramatic than flight or super strength, but in its own way more unnerving. The sense of a man who is always thinking, who has already imagined the disaster and already prepared the answer. The underworld he moves through runs deeper than even the famous names we have gathered, for his rogues gallery is so vast that it seems to hold a dark reflection of every kind of human brokenness. There are the cold and ruthless crime bosses who rule the city's gangs, men of masks and money and ordinary, human cruelty, more grounded than the costumed madman but no less dangerous. There are the hired killers and the marksmen who never miss, the assassins for whom murder is simply a trade, some of them longing, in their own strange way, for the one target who might finally best them. There are the arsonists in love with fire, and the disturbed souls who keep terrible count of their crimes, and the shambling, sorrowful monsters dragged up out of the city's forgotten places, each one a different note in the long, sad music of the gallery. Part of what makes that gallery so beloved is that so many of its members are not simply evil, but broken, wounded, tragic. People who were hurt, or twisted, or driven mad, and who might, in another life, or with a little more mercy, have been saved. The mythology returns again and again to that idea, that the line between the hero and his enemies is thinner than it looks, that Batman himself is a man who suffered a terrible trauma and reshaped his whole life around it, exactly as so many of his foes did, and that the only real difference, in the end, is the direction each of them chose to turn their pain. He turned his outward into protection. They turned theirs outward into cruelty. That they are all, in a sense, children of the same darkness, and some part of him knows it, and it is part of why he can never quite bring himself to give up on any of them. It is that refusal to give up, more than anything, that defines the shape of his endless war, the stubborn, almost unreasonable insistence that even the worst of them might still be reached, might still be healed, might still be something other than what they have become. He captures rather than kills, he hopes rather than despairs, he returns his broken enemies again and again to the asylum on the edge of the city, in the quiet, unspoken belief that a cure might one day be found. that no one is ever truly beyond saving. It is a hope that the world around him rarely rewards, a hope that costs him dearly and is disappointed again and again, and yet he holds to it, night after night, year after year, and there is something in that stubborn, wounded faith that is perhaps the very heart of him. There is a whole quiet art to the way he fights, and it is worth dwelling on, because it is so much stranger and more deliberate than simply throwing punches in the dark. From the very beginning, the choice of a bat was a choice about fear, a decision to become a living nightmare, and everything about his method flows from that single idea. He works in darkness and in silence, striking from above and from behind, appearing without warning and vanishing before his enemies can gather themselves, letting rumour and shadow do half his work for him, so that hardened criminals come to dread the mere possibility of him jumping at every creak and every shifting shadow. He understood long ago that a frightened enemy is already half beaten, and he has spent his whole career weaponizing the dark. That theatricality is a thing he chose on purpose, the great grim performance of it, the cape that makes him seem larger than he is, the cowl that hides every human feature, the low voice, the sudden disappearances that leave even his allies talking to empty air. He wants to seem more than a man, something closer to a force of nature or a vengeful ghost. Because a man can be fought and beaten and understood, but a legend, a shadow, a creature of the night is far harder to stand against. In one famous and oft-repeated declaration, he names himself Vengeance and names himself the Night, and there is a terrible poetry in it. The sense of a person who has, quite deliberately, tried to turn himself into an idea, into a piece of the darkness itself, aimed like a weapon at the guilty. And yet beneath all that carefully built terror there is always the grieving and lonely human being, and nowhere does that show more tenderly than in his loves, in the handful of people who have, over the long years, managed to slip past the armour and touch the man inside it. There was an early fiancé in his very first years, and a sharp and curious reporter who was forever circling too close to his secret. And there was the thief on the rooftops who understood his shadows better than anyone, and the daughter of his great enemy who loved him across an unbridgeable divide. Again and again the stories give him the chance at ordinary happiness, at love, at a life beyond the war, and again something in him, or something in the mission, holds it just out of reach. One of the most quietly heartbreaking of those romances involved a woman who did the rarest of things, who came to love Bruce Wayne, and then worked out, entirely on her own, the terrible secret he carried, and who found, in the end, that she simply could not bear it, could not live with the knowledge that the man she loved went out each night to be hurt and to risk everything, and so she left him, not out of any lack of love, but out of an excess of it. It is a particularly sad kind of ending, the love that fails, not because it was too weak, but because the life he had chosen was too heavy for any ordinary happiness to survive beside it. And it captures something essential about the price of the cowl, that it costs him not only his rest and his safety, but the very possibility of being fully known and fully loved. That perhaps is the deepest loneliness of him, deeper even than the empty house or the solitary vigil, the sense that to truly love him is to be asked to stand and watch him walk into danger night after night, and that few hearts can carry such a thing for long. He holds people at a distance in part to protect them from his enemies, and in part, one suspects, to protect himself from the unbearable fear of losing anyone else the way he lost his parents, and so he remains, for all his strange and gathered family, essentially alone, loved by many and truly known by almost none. The warm and grieving man forever, sealed away inside the cold and frightening symbol he built to survive. Let us wander for a little while longer back down into the cave beneath the manor, because its treasures each hold a small story, and there is something soothing in the cataloguing of them. Those enormous trophies scattered through the great cavern are not random decorations but souvenirs, each one hauled home from a particular case and kept as a quiet monument to it. The giant penny came from a confrontation with a coin-obsessed criminal long ago. The towering mechanical dinosaur was carried back from an adventure on an island of enormous robotic beasts. The oversized playing card is a memento of his endless duel with the Joker. To walk through the cave, in a sense, is to walk through his whole life's work, a museum of victories and sorrows with only one visitor who ever truly understands what any of it means. Around those great trophies hums the working heart of the place, the vast computer that is among the most powerful in the world, its databases holding files on nearly everyone of consequence, its screens glowing in the dark as the detective sifts through evidence in the small and sleepless hours. There is a full forensic laboratory down there, and a gymnasium, and a medical bay, and a great vault of costumes, and everything else a one-man war might require, all of it hidden beneath the innocent old house, all of it kept secret from a world that sees only the careless millionaire upstairs. The cave is his truest home, far more than the mansion above it, the one place where he can take off the daytime mask and simply be the grieving, driven man he has always been. From that cave rolls and flies and sails a whole fleet of remarkable machines, for the famous black car is only the most beloved of them. Over the decades he has taken to the skies in a series of aircraft, dark-bat winged planes and jets that let him range far beyond the city. He has crossed the water in sleek boats built to his design. He has torn through narrow streets on specialized cycles when the great car would not fit. Each vehicle has been reimagined 100 times across the years, growing sleeker or bulkier or more heavily armoured with the changing tastes of each age. But all of them share that same unmistakable identity, that same dark and purposeful menace, extensions all of the single grim idea at the centre of him. It is worth returning, as we drift toward the end, to the very beginning of it all, to the small publishing milestones from which this whole vast world unfurled, because there is a gentle pleasure in the tracing of firsts. That debut appearance in the spring of 1939 proved so popular that within a year the character was given a comic all his own, and it was in the very first issue of that self-titled book that two of his most enduring figures, the laughing clown and the jewel thief cat, both made their entrance at once, an astonishing debut that would shape the rest of his history in a single stroke. From those earliest issues the world of Gotham began rapidly to fill in, villain by villain and ally by ally, until within just a few short years most of the essential pieces of the legend were already in place. The signal in the sky, that most poetic of his tools, appeared within those first few years as well, and the boy partner arrived barely a year into the character's life, and the faithful butler a few years after that, so that the whole familiar constellation of the mythology assembled itself remarkably quickly, in a great early burst of invention by young men making it up as fast as they could. And the humble comic that started it all, that 10-cent pamphlet from 1939, has become one of the most coveted objects in the entire hobby, the finest surviving copies changing hands for well over $1 million. A staggering sum for a thin little booklet that was once considered disposable cheap entertainment for children, meant to be read once and thrown away. There is a lovely irony folded into that a thing made to be disposable became instead nearly immortal, that the cheap dime comic outlasted the men who made it and the newsstands that sold it and the very era that produced it, and goes on being read and loved and reinvented nearly a century later. It says something hopeful about the strange things that endure, about how you can never quite tell, in the moment of making something, whether it will vanish next week or outlive everyone you know. Two young men drew a bat-caped figure to make a quick sale, and somehow breathed into him a life that has now stretched across the better part of 100 years and shows no sign at all of ending. One last quiet marvel deserves a place before we let the night close in, and it is this: that no single person ever really wrote him, that the figure we have been wandering through all this while was built, piece by piece, by hundreds and hundreds of hands across the better part of a century. Almost everything we now think of as essential to him arrived not in a single flash of invention, but gradually, added by one writer or artist after another, each contributing a villain or a gadget or a piece of the origin or a single perfect line, until the accumulated work of all those imaginations became the towering thing we know, the scattering pearls, the tragic backstories of his foes, the shape of the cave, the voice, the code. All of it was found and refined by different people in different decades, layered slowly over the years like sediment into stone. He has been carried, too, through nearly every form of storytelling the last century has invented, far beyond the comics and the films. He crept out of radios in the 1940s, spoken rather than drawn, a voice in the dark of countless living rooms. He appeared in newspaper strips that ran alongside the funnies, and in cheap novels, and in songs. And eventually in the games and the streaming shows and the endless merchandise of the modern age. Each new medium took him up and made him its own, and handed him on, and somehow, through all of it, across all those different hands and forms and generations, he remained recognisably, unmistakably himself, the sane, grieving, driven, gentle-hearted creature of the night beneath all the changing surfaces. Part of what makes that continuity so remarkable is that it has genuinely never stopped, for the character has appeared in new stories, month after month, almost without interruption, since that very first issue in 1939, an unbroken chain of publications stretching across more than 8 decades. Through wars and depressions and the rise and fall of whole industries, very few creations of any kind can claim so long and so continuous a life, and it means that there are people who have followed him from childhood into old age, and parents who have handed him down to children who have handed him down again, so that he has become a kind of shared inheritance, passed quietly from one generation to the next, like a well-loved story told at bedtime. And that, in the end, is perhaps the gentlest truth about him, that he belongs now to everyone and to no one, that he has outgrown any single author or actor or artist, and become a piece of the common imagination, a figure as freely and widely known as any folk hero or fairy tale king. A child who has never read a comic in their life still knows the bat on the chest, still knows the cape and the cowl and the car, still knows, somehow, the broken shape of the story, the parents in the alley, the promise made in grief. He has passed out of the hands of his makers and into the shared dreaming of the whole world, which is the closest thing a made-up person can ever come to immortality. And it all grew, gently and improbably, from a single sad idea about a boy who lost everything and chose to turn his sorrow into a light for others. There is a genuine and long-running question folded quietly into his stories, one the best of them are honest enough to raise, and it is whether a figure like him truly heals his troubled city, or whether, in some strange way, he feeds its madness. For it is a curious fact that before he appeared, Gotham's criminals were mostly ordinary gangsters and crooks, and that it was only after the coming of the Bat that the city began to fill with theatrical, costumed madmen, as though his own grand performance had called forth answering performances, as though by becoming a symbol he had inadvertently invited others to become symbols too. The stories return to this uneasy idea again and again, never quite settling it, letting the reader wonder whether the cure and the sickness might be tangled together. Set against that troubling thought is the simpler and warmer truth that he has given his frightened city something it desperately needed, which is hope, a sense that someone is watching over the dark streets, that the powerful and the cruel are not entirely beyond reach, that a single determined person can refuse to let the night win. Whatever madness may swirl around him, the ordinary and forgotten people of Gotham, the ones who will never make a headline, look up at that light on the clouds and feel, for a moment, a little less alone and a little less afraid, and that quiet gift is perhaps as real and as important as any villain he has ever caught. The debate has no final answer, and that is exactly why it endures, a genuine and thoughtful shadow at the edge of the legend. And so we come, gently, to the end of the long parade, to the question of why, after all of it, this one figure endures the way he does, beloved across more than 80 years and every medium ever invented, when so many others have faded. Part of the answer, surely, is that he asks a strange and hopeful thing of us, for unlike the heroes who are born on distant worlds or struck by lightning or granted their gifts by chance, he made himself out of nothing but grief and will and refusal, which means that his story is, at its heart, about the terrible and beautiful things an ordinary person can do with pain. He is what a human being might become through sheer relentless effort, and there is a dark comfort in that, and a dark challenge too. But the deeper answer, the one that keeps him alive in the quiet places of so many hearts, is that underneath the gadgets and the villains and the spectacle, he is a story about grief, and about what we choose to do with it. Here is a child who suffered the worst thing imaginable, who could so easily have become cruel or bitter or broken, who could so easily have become another of the monsters, and who chose instead, at enormous and permanent cost to his own happiness, to spend his whole life making sure that no one else would have to suffer what he suffered. He turns his pain outward as protection rather than inward as poison, and that choice, made again every single night, is the real heroism of him, far more than any punch ever thrown. There is a great sadness in him too, and it would be dishonest to drift past it, for the life he has chosen is a lonely one, and the stories know it, and never entirely let him off the hook for it. He holds the people he loves at a careful distance. He cannot quite allow himself ordinary happiness. He lies awake in a cave beneath an empty house, preparing for disasters that may never come. And some part of him is still, always, that frozen child in the alley, unable to put down the grief, unable to stop keeping a promise he made when he was far too young to make it. He saves everyone, in the end, except perhaps himself, and there is something both noble and unbearably sad in that. A man who gives the whole world the safety and the peace he can never quite give himself. And yet, for all the sorrow, the enduring image of him is not one of despair, but of a strange, stubborn hope, the light thrown up against the clouds. The promise that no matter how dark the night or how deep the corruption, someone is out there, watching, refusing to give up, ready to answer when the frightened call. He is the guardian who never sleeps so that others can, the one who takes the fear onto himself so that the city beneath him can rest, and there is a deep and gentle comfort in that idea, especially now, especially here in the quiet dark. The thought of a tireless protector standing watch over the sleeping streets, asking nothing, wanting nothing, simply keeping the long vigil so that everyone else can finally, safely, close their eyes. There is nothing left to chase tonight. No signal in the sky, and no case still open, and no shadow left to follow through the dark. You have wandered a long way through the history of the Dark Knight, through the men who made him and the city he guards and the long parade of friends and foes who fill his world, and it is time now to let all of it settle, and go quiet and fade. So let it all drift over you softly now, the way the quiet settles over a great dark city in the last hour before dawn, when even the sirens have gone still, and the rain has finally stopped, and the streets lie empty and washed clean beneath the fading light of a bat-shaped signal. The dime comic that became a fortune, the two young men who dreamed him up, the boy in the alley and the vow he made, the long line of Robins and the faithful old butler, the laughing man and the whole gallery of the broken, all of it, laid out gently in the dark for you to drift through, and now to leave behind. Let your breathing slow, let the room grow warm and safe around you. Somewhere the great dark city is quiet at last, its villains sleeping in their cells, its case files closed, its long night finally giving way toward morning, and somewhere in a cave beneath an old mansion, even the man who never sleeps has perhaps at last closed his eyes. You do not have to keep watch tonight. Nothing here needs solving anymore. The city will keep itself until morning, all its shadows still, all its stories gently told. You have wandered a long way tonight, through 85 years of a legend, and you are allowed now to simply stop and rest. Good night, and sleep well.